Goethe once wrote that poetry is a worldly gospel, and the conflation of art and religion and the connection between art and the fundamental or most important human aspirations is articulated beautifully, and as it is articulated nowhere else in Goethe's Faust. Goethe's Faust is one of the most remarkable productions of the human mind, and it's one of the greatest achievements of the Western literary tradition. It was composed over the course of 60 years. In other words, he wrote it in his 20s and finished it in his 80s, and played with it and revised it and added to it through the course of his lifetime. It is a dramatic, or it's usually described as a dramatic poem, but it in fact is a work of art like no other. In other words, it almost doesn't have a genre. It is the only example of itself. In some respects, it's like the Platonic dialogues, right? It's the only example of that particular genre. Well, I'd be inclined to say that Goethe's Faust is an artistic creation like no other. If you get the opportunity to commit yourself to this poem, because this poem is not a quick read, it's a commitment. It's something you have to stop and think about. It will well repay your effort and time. It is a poem which makes greater demands on the reader than perhaps any other work of Western literature, with the possible exception of Joyce's Ulysses. And it minimally presupposes that you have some background in classical mythology. It would be nice if you knew something about the history of philosophy. It would also be helpful if you knew something about the history of science. And it would be handy if you either had a teacher to explain this book to you, or if you had some annotated edition which allowed you to understand the references. Particularly the second part, which is often ignored by the casual reader as being essentially incomprehensible, is very, very much worth your time and effort. But it is a commitment of time and effort, and you can't miss that. The first fragments of Faust, the first parts of it, were written in the 1770s, when Goethe was still a young man, actually at the time that he was writing The Sorrows of Young Werther. And the first part of the Faust was published in 1790. It was an instantaneous hit, one of the most influential fragmentary works in the history of Western literature. The entirety of the first part was published in 1808, and he finally published the second part of Faust in 1832. So we're moving from the 1770s to the 1830s, stepping from the 18th through the 19th century, covering essentially the entirety of German Romanticism and one of the high points of Western European culture. Now, it's hard to know what to analogize Faust to. It's really not like other poems. If you had to connect it with any kind of cultural artifact, I'd be inclined to connect it to something like Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, in the sense that it does some things that you would never expect this particular form to be able to do. It breaks through old barriers, and having done this, it fundamentally changes the way we hear music or read poetry. You might want to analogize it to the work of Hegel, the Phenomenology of Spirit, a work of philosophy which is so inclusive and so remarkable for its intellectual scope that it seems to fundamentally change the way we think about thinking. Well, Goethe's Faust changes the way we think about poetry. Now, there are many strange qualities to this poem. In the first place, it lacks many of the Aristotelian unities. It doesn't have, for example, one particular theme. Rather, its theme is everything, or the entirety of human experience. And not only that, but at least the second part doesn't have much in the way of unity of place, right? The location for the second part is either heaven or hell or Holland or nowhere. It depends on what part of the book you're looking at, and it's hard to see how you could possibly present this as a dramatic activity. In other words, how would you put such a thing on stage? It seems to me essentially impossible. Perhaps it's been tried, but it seems like an impossible task to me. Maybe something like film could handle Faust because of the magical, dreamlike qualities of the second part. But apart from that, it seems to me something that demands to be read, and read carefully. Now, the minor characters in Faust are a strange collection of warriors and femme fatales and demons and monsters and witches and fairies and heroes, ancient Greek philosophers, ancient Greek literary figures. All kinds of people are introduced in the course of this novel. Goethe has done quite a bit of reading. And all of this reading is synthesized and brought to a sort of essence in this book. The main characters are among the greatest achievements of literary activity. In the first place, we have Faust himself. Faust, the man who has studied law, theology, medicine, jurisprudence, and has absorbed all worldly knowledge, is dissatisfied and miserable. In other words, the man of pure intellect is a man who finds the passive life of the scholar unsatisfactory, who is rendered miserable by the fact that he is unable to find any real value in the world. He sees the world as a collection that's heterogeneous and meaningless, and is unable to derive any sort of real satisfaction from the fact that he has conquered all the branches of knowledge. Out of more, I guess, world weariness than blasphemy, he ultimately makes a deal, or he early in the poem, makes a deal with Mephistopheles to sell his soul and get unusual powers and unusual experiences in the world, but it's not out of a desire to assault God or to offer an affront to God. He has doubts about the existence of God. Rather, he is simply full of ennui. The world of scholarship, the world of contemplation as opposed to action, is sterile and pointless. Now, Faust is a sort of hero, but he is a conceptual hero who is trying to take control of both internal nature and external nature. In the course of the play, he will come to master the external world, but much more importantly, he will come to master himself, the internal world, his mind or soul or psyche, and that will be the fundamental change that Faust undergoes. He will undergo a tremendous degradation morally and eventually be saved, and saved as a consequence of his activity and his ceaseless striving. Faust is a universal hero of culture who represents all of human aspiration and all of human striving. He touches all the human bases. And then, and only then, does he say he has finally found value. Then and only then does he say, "Stay, moment, stay, thou art so fair." So when he has finally touched all the human bases and understood that the striving after lofty goals is the loftiest of goals, that the chase and the quarry are the same thing, that we come to understand what the human condition is. We are redeemed and ennobled by our activity. We are improved and rendered whole by our ceaseless striving. And this is not just within the realm of knowledge, it is also within the realm of art. I would say that Goethe is a very Faustian figure, right? Because he himself is bringing all this together. Now, the second, and in my mind, the most intriguing and entertaining figure in this poem is Mephistopheles. Mephistopheles introduces himself beautifully. He says, "I am the spirit which negates. I am the spirit which says no." The opposite of affirmation of this world is Mephistopheles. And I think that every scholar at some point has had this in his brain. It's hard to say whether we should understand Mephistopheles as being entirely external to Faust. In some respects, Mephistopheles is Faust's alter ego. He is the negative half of the scholar's activity. He is composed of loveless passion, pitiless skepticism, nihilistic knowledge. And Mephistopheles is a representation of all which is most evil in human life or in the human soul. He is not really external to Faust. In some respects, he is a figment of Faust's imagination. He is the embodiment of all which is worst in Faust himself. On the other hand, let me not be too hard on him. He's a very witty devil. I mean, as funny devils go, he's a great one. He says all kinds of ironic, humorous things. And if you know the references that he makes, and you have read the Bible thoroughly, and you're familiar with Greek philosophy and things like that, you can see that he's a very well-read devil. I mean, he's gotten to all the important books. So it makes all kinds of interesting allusions while saying entertaining and humorous things. You can't expect more from, the son of Satan or something along those lines. Now, our final character is Gretchen. And Gretchen represents innocence, represents the object of human striving. Right at the end of the second part, we will see that Goethe tells us that die ewige Weiblich zieht uns hinan, which means that the eternal feminine leads us aloft. A very inscrutable, very difficult line to interpret, but we could say that Gretchen herself represents the eternal feminine. She is the object of Faust's desire, but his desire is purified by his activity, and ultimately the evil that he does towards her, because Faust treats Gretchen very badly, she dies at the end of the first act, or the first part, ends up being ennobled. In other words, all our sins can be forgiven, but not forgiven on account of our guilt and repentance. All our sins are ultimately forgiven on the basis of our connection to the spirit of creativity. In some respects, Gretchen represents that. She also represents the innocent and naive part of German culture. She represents a great many things because this poem works on so many symbolic levels. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about the action of this play or poem. And the difficulty here is that it's like talking about the plot of the Bible and saying, well, we're going to wrap this up and move straight on. I can only give you the sketchiest idea of what the action of the play is. It should be a propedeutic, a kind of stimulus to you to go and look at the book itself and then make the commitment to take it seriously. But it's all I can possibly do within these constraints of time. The first part, Book 1, can be thought of as the microcosm. He talks about German culture, and Gretchen, as a symbol of German culture, is seduced and abandoned. Faust has his moral fall here. We can look at this as the fall of Faust, but also as the fall of every man. World weariness, the movement from one experience to another, is insatiable and never ends. Gretchen is ultimately abandoned by Faust because he will not say, "Stay, moment, stay, thou art so fair." Faust, in the first book, like Mephistopheles throughout the book, does not understand love. Faust, by the end of the second book, does understand love, and Mephistopheles never comes to understand love. That's what ultimately defeats Mephistopheles. All right? So in some respects, this is the most optimistic of works, and that's one of the reasons why it repays reading and careful consideration on your part. All right, first part, we get a prologue in heaven. Those of you who are here for my lectures on the book of Job, well, we get God and the angels and, of course, Satan. And Satan and God are chatting. And it doesn't get, like the book of Job, it doesn't get explained what Satan is doing there or why he has a chat with God, but he does. And they talk a little bit about Faust, the way they do about Job. And God says to Satan, look, I know things are going to work out okay, but if you want to go down Mephistopheles and tempt him and cause him all kinds of difficulties, we'll go and do so. I'm going to kind of reference back to the Old Testament. And we then move from this prologue in heaven to Faust's study, where he is sitting around among his books thinking about suicide. His search for knowledge has been successful, and often we are as harmed by our achievements as we are by our failures. Faust, as a hero, as an epitome of human intellectual activity, has found that the world is meaningless and unsatisfying. He is considering suicide, and he is stopped from committing suicide when he hears the Easter bells. It turns out, fortunately for us, to be Easter Sunday. And Easter bells, as a symbol of Christianity, as a symbol of resurrection, as a symbol of hope, which is one of the Christian virtues, makes him withdraw and hold back. His assistant, named Wagner, goes out for a walk with him, and they meet a dog. And it's not just any dog, it's Mephistopheles. Now, since Faust himself dabbles in the black arts, is a necromancer, and knows something about sorcery, he conjures the devil out of the dog, and they have a nice little chat. And it turns out that Mephistopheles, in this case, is represented as a scholar. Later on, he'll come back dressed as a nobleman. He's kind of a Protean fellow. It turns out that Mephistopheles is here for his soul. And Faust says to Mephistopheles, well, that would be okay. You can have my soul. A, I doubt that I have one. B, if I have one, it's not very interesting or very good. C, I'm not worried about eternal damnation. Hell, I'm already damned as it is now. Any hell that you can send me to couldn't be as bad as this barren desert of knowledge I live in. So he sells his soul to Mephistopheles, and Mephistopheles is quite a legalistic fellow, insists that it be signed in blood. Faust is willing to go through that. And off they go on their adventures. Faust is going to get a chance to touch all the human bases. And the terms of their agreement are these. While in this world, Mephistopheles will serve Faust and will do all the things that Faust bids, all the things that he wishes, gets him all kinds of pleasure, money, wealth, sex, anything. In exchange for that, if Faust is able to find anything valuable in this world, if there's anything which he grasps and wishes to hold on to, if there is any fraction of time which he is willing to say should be removed from the flux of becoming and turned into a permanent being, into a final reality, if he is ever driven to the point where he says, "Stay, moment, stay, thou art so fair," then he is damned, and then Mephistopheles can have him. His idea is that the world contains nothing valuable, and the ennui has driven him to this devilish bargain. Now, first thing they do is go to a beer cellar. They see a bunch of men having drinks, and all Faust says while he is in this beer cellar is, "Let's get out of here." In other words, he is too cerebral, too ethereal to find pleasure in drunkenness, right, in the kind of common pleasures that we see in the beer cellar. From there, they go to a witch's kitchen, and because Mephistopheles is in good with the witches, right, he manages to have 30 years taken off Faust's age, and this movement back to youth is not a movement back to innocence, it is a move back to passion, a movement back to an openness towards a lust for life, which Faust has completely lost. They come to a city. Boy meets girl, or at least in this case Faust meets girl, in this case Gretchen. And Gretchen is a symbol of innocence, a symbol of inexperience, and she is fairly easily seduced by the intelligent Faust and the crafty and, of course, Mephistophelian Mephistopheles. He gives her some jewels. Gretchen's mother finds the jewels and gives them to the church. And there's a great deal of kind of subtext here and overt statements that are rather anti-clerical in tone. The church is a grasping kind of a cynical, kind of a greedy outfit. So he comes back with more jewels. Gretchen doesn't tell her mother. They go to the house of a woman named Martha, who's a sort of foil to Gretchen. And this foil to Gretchen is very crass and materialistic, so Mephistopheles kind of likes her. And she arranges a liaison, or helps the liaison along between Faust and Gretchen, and Faust is becoming more and more caught up with her, but he also has some misgivings about his lust. He'd like to turn his lust into love and doesn't quite know how. There's a beautiful passage here that comes right after this scene, sometimes called the quartet, in which two couples, both couples, Martha and Mephistopheles and Gretchen and Faust, are walking around, and we only hear snatches of their conversation. So if you can imagine something composed like a string quartet, well, we hear opposite sorts of approaches to the world. The coarse, cynical, materialistic couple and the Faust-Gretchen couple, who represent innocence and experience, or guiltiness and guilt, and the opposite, the absence of guilt, something along those lines. It is put together, and it sounds in German much like a string quartet. I mean, you have to stop and think about it. You almost wish that this part were sung rather than spoken. I mean, there ought to be some sort of musical score here, but he's not Beethoven, so we'll let it slide. From there, they go to a summer house. They kiss for the first time. It seems that they are both falling in love insofar as Faust is able to fall in love at all. Remember that he's the guy that sees no value in the world. And then there's a long, cynical passage in which Faust and Mephistopheles are talking, and Faust is brooding in the forest, saying, "Is this the right thing to do? What shall I do with this woman? I'm not familiar with strong feeling. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. Here I am 30 years younger, and I'm not prepared for the emotional consequences of that." Well, Mephistopheles says all kinds of cutting things about his would-be idealism. He says, look, this is physical desire, and you're trying to rationalize it. I mean, go read the works of Freud if you want to see what the real subtext of this is. He says, you're kidding yourself. What this really is desire, and the fact she's really innocent and graceful and kind and nice just fuels your desire. Stop kidding yourself. Right? A very cold and cynical interpretation. From there, we go back to Gretchen's room, where she gives the famous spinning wheel song, one of the great speeches of innocent desire. She's clearly in love. Although she will be seduced later on, this seduction is not really imposed upon her. She really wants to be seduced. She has fallen in love with this mysterious stranger. From there, we go back to Martha's garden, and Gretchen, in her naivete and innocence, asks Faust about his religious views. And of course, Faust does a kind of a song and dance here. He doesn't want to talk about God and Jesus, because he really doesn't believe that sort of stuff. He says, look, I'm quite tolerant, which is a way of saying I'm quite indifferent. And he also says, not only am I quite tolerant, but I think of God as being a kind of creativity. He's not a very dogmatic or religious God, a very unorthodox religiosity, insofar as it can be called religiosity at all. And Once we see this, Gretchen is made kind of uncomfortable by this because she has, if not a conventional morality, she certainly believes in a sort of conventional orthodox religion. And she says, okay, I can gloss over your lack of religiosity, but your friend, Mephistopheles, I have this bad feeling about him. I don't like that guy. And of course, Gretchen and Mephistopheles have a definite dislike of each other. Innocence and, the embodiment of sin. It's hard. It's easy to see why they don't get along. Now, Faust wants to go to her room, have sex with her. She agrees, but she says, look, my mom lives with me. We have to do something about her. Mephistopheles comes to hand, gives Gretchen a sleeping potion. You pour this in your mom's coffee or whatever it is she's drinking. You give this to her. She goes to sleep. You can have sex. You won't get caught. Fine. So they do. The next part, we move past the sex. Think of the conventions of 19th century Germany. Don't have a sex scene, but clearly they have had sex. Gretchen is now pregnant, and Faust has abandoned her. Remember, stay moment, stay, thou art so fair. He won't stay with any one experience. He sees no value in the world. What happens then? Gretchen begins to have qualms. Conventional morality starts to set in. Another girl is gossiping about some other woman that's become pregnant. Her lover has left her, and Gretchen begins to despair. She thinks, oh my God, look what I've done. Look what's happened to me. Now, her brother Valentine, who gets brought in, and he hasn't made an appearance yet, is a soldier, a martial man, who's heard that his sister is pregnant, has lost her virtue to some mysterious stranger. Valentine wants to find the evildoer and even the score with him. Of course, conveniently, Faust and Mephistopheles come because Faust wants to sleep with Gretchen again. They encounter Valentine and they arbitrarily kill him. In other words, they take magical advantage of him and he's killed. And just as he's dying, he curses his sister, who is, of course, overwrought. And this is the low point in Faust's moral degradation. He kills this guy arbitrarily. He treats Gretchen very badly. He has contempt for love. And this is the bottom of the pit for him. Now, after that, we see Gretchen in the nave of a cathedral. And there, two things happen to her. One, she is pursued by an evil spirit. In this case, the evil spirit of guilt. One of the bad parts about Christianity is the fact that it forces upon people a guilt which really does not redeem them. Redemption in this play comes from creative activity. Brooding, morose guilt is the worst part about the Christian religion. And not only that, but here's a religious song called the Dies Irae. In Latin, that means Day of Wrath. It is a part of the traditional Catholic funeral mass. So the Dies Irae, God's wrathful judgment on the souls of the damned, all right, begins to drive Gretchen towards madness. She has many similarities to Ophelia in Hamlet. So those of you that know Hamlet will see many complementary elements in our Gretchen. Now, while she is in the cathedral, Mephistopheles and Faust are off at the Walpurgisnacht, a kind of witches' Sabbath, where spirits and fairies and witches get together for a kind of drunken, sexual kind of a revel. It's the inverse of the Christian Mass. And while Faust is encountering some beautiful young witch, strangely enough, a red mouse crawls out of her mouth. Now, I don't know where he got this image, but it's terribly arresting. A red mouse. I mean, by itself, it's not too horrible, but you think about it, the worse it gets. And immediately, he thinks of Gretchen for reasons that are not immediately clear to me. And he says, we must go back and rescue Gretchen. And Mephistopheles says, no, we can't go back and rescue Gretchen. There's a back and forth. They go to a theatrical performance, which doesn't have a great deal to do with the play. One of the difficulties in Faust is that it's enough for about 12 different works of art. And this digression into the theater is, in fact, that. It's a digression. But it's a beautiful digression. Digress though they do, they go back and try and rescue Gretchen. The difficulty they encounter is this. Gretchen is now crazy and wants to be punished for her sins. In other words, she buys into conventional Christian morality. At first, when Mephistopheles and Faust show up, she doesn't recognize Faust. Then she does recognize him and say, oh, thank God you're here. Now I think everything is going to be fine. They say, let's go. We have to run because you're going to be killed. Gretchen, incidentally, has already had the child at this point, and she's committed infanticide, and she's going to be executed. She's been driven mad by the guilt, and now she wants to, to stay and take her punishment. She feels that that's the only way to atone for her sins. Well, they take off, and what Mephistopheles says is, look, she's condemned. There's nothing we can do about this. Let's go. She is condemned. And then a voice from heaven says, is saved. Of course, it's the voice of God saying, look, Mephistopheles says she's condemned. God saying, look, I run things around here. I decide who's saved and condemned. She may be killed, but that's not the same thing as being condemned. She is ultimately going to aid in Faust's salvation. She will go to heaven despite her sins. Right? Innocence is, in some respects, a mitigating circumstance. Perhaps from the universal perspective, the idea of guilt at all is a misapprehension. Right? There are many possible romantic readings of this. All right, let's get right on to section 2, give you a sense of what's going on there. Now, I can't give you the same level of detail that I did in section 1, and that's not any too detailed. But remember, this is 12,000 lines of poetry, and it is exquisitely metrical, and it's rhymed. Right? And he covers all the major metrical forms. So we have hexameters, we have dactyls, we have all different kinds of poetic forms, and the connection between the form and the content is that when he's covering ancient Greece, as he's going to in the second part, he uses typically Greek forms. When he covers a tragic section, he uses tragic forms. In fact, in one section, when he moves actually out of poetry altogether and towards prose with the idea of just shocking us into a recognition that this is a special part. So it's an amazing piece of work. And when we move into the different kinds of meter and rhyme and the simply formal elements of Faust, you know that you're in the presence of a great genius. To be able to think this up requires genius by itself. To be able to actually formulate this in a language that's so resistant to poetic activity as German, a very difficult language to rhyme, for example, it's an amazing achievement. No wonder it took him 60 years. Now, part 2 starts in a pleasing landscape. Faustus forgot all of his ill treatment of Gretchen. Gretchen is now dead. She's been executed. What this suggests, he's in a pleasing romantic landscape. He's been given a kind of oblivion, is that this forgetfulness, this lack of guilt, is a kind of secular absolution. In other words, one way of handling this is to show that Faust is in a way too wise to become guilty, or too wise to take guilt to the same extreme that Gretchen does. Instead, he's going to redeem himself through constructive activity. Our striving, our attempt to create in this world is what ultimately redeems us. Well, they are in the study of Wagner, the former assistant of Faust, who has now become a professor himself. Wagner has been engaged in putting together Homunculus, a tiny little man. It represents the acme of intellectual activity, also represents intellect. It represents a great many things. I mean, the protean imagination of Goethe is quite remarkable. And there's a number of ironic interchanges between a student and Mephistopheles. And we also get an attempt to connect Greek culture with German culture. In other words, if part 1 is mostly organized around German culture, part 2 is organized around classical culture. This is an attempt to unify the classic and the romantic, to link up German culture with the culture of ancient Greece. And Goethe is not the only person to try this project. Think of what Hegel's philosophy of history amounts to. Right? The tradition of German idealism is clearly a reflection or an extrapolation from the tradition of Greek idealism. Certainly, Hegel thought that the Germans were the new Greeks. Now, the next thing that they do, they go to the classical Walpurgisnacht. Now, rather than burden you with what the classical Walpurgisnacht amounts to, I will just say that it's some thousands of lines of poetry, and it involves a tremendous number of allusions to classical mythology, classical philosophy, and classical science. It's the kind of thing that you need the annotated edition to get through. All right? Even professional scholars move very slowly through something like this. The point is that we have here the unification of the classic and the romantic. The third part of this, the third section of the second part, we find that Faust is now connected to Greece. What has happened is something like this. Faust has undertaken the service of an emperor in Europe, and the emperor wants to see Helen of Troy. Helen of Troy is produced through the agency of Mephistopheles and a group of rather cryptic women or mysterious women called the Mothers, the Eternal Mothers. Apparently the idea is something like this. Now that we're going back to classical Greece, we're going to try and retrieve Helen of Troy in the classical tradition. Faust, being a Christian devil, doesn't have much efficacy there. You have to go back to the mothers, to some ancient classical tradition, some spirit which will allow you to perform some kind of sorcery there. Well, Faust, through the aid of the mothers and Mephistopheles, brings Helen of Troy into the emperor's court. And of course, the courtiers are too dumb to understand what paragons and what great epitomes of humanity Helen of Troy and her lover Paris are. But of course, Faust, being a man of considerable cultivation, does see some perfection in Helen of Troy and ultimately wants her as a kind of substitute for Gretchen. In the first case, in the first book, he's seduced Gretchen, who sort of represents German culture, and then abandoned her. In the second part, he's going to lust after and ultimately seduce Helen of Troy, representative of Greek culture, and what we're going to do at the end is assume that die ewige Weiblich zieht uns hinan, the eternal feminine leads us aloft, leads us towards salvation, but also towards loftier accomplishments. Well, they go back to ancient Greece, and Mephistopheles, by carefully orchestrated lies, helps Helen of Troy and the women who are with her after the Trojan War go back. And what happens is that they eventually have a son, they have sex, and their son is Euphorion, who is modeled on the Romantic poet Byron. What occurs next is, of course, that because of the evanescent and kind of morbid element in Romanticism, Euphorion, in an attempt to fly, like Icarus in Greek mythology, dies, and as a consequence, Helen in her grief disappears, suggests to us that beauty and love are evanescent and not permanent, right? The becoming as opposed to being that Faust sees everywhere is instantiated here. Thereafter, Faust and Mephistopheles help the emperor defeat some rival in a campaign. Faust is given an area of land which is not very valuable, but because Faust is now interested in political issues, interested in the improvement of society, begins a program of reclaiming land from the sea. I guess the idea here is Holland. The point is something like this. The sea represents nature, the land represents culture, and Faust's ceaseless striving is to extend the realm of culture and to defeat nature. We are told towards the end of Faust that that we must continually and ceaselessly strive to extend our boundaries. Faust is touching all the human bases here. He has been to ancient Greece. He has touched classical culture. He has absorbed German culture. He has engaged in all kinds of activities, war and politics and nation building. Faust is the universal man. He is now 100 years old, and one of the last things he wants to do is organize his society, get rid of the old gods, get rid of the old kind of pious traditions, and the way to do that is by making everyone in his domain surrender their land. And there's a couple, an old couple named Philemon and Baucis. They still worship the old god, and they still live on land that had been around before he reclaimed it from the sea. As a result, he says he sends some of his men, an army unit, in to take their house and forcibly evict them. In the process, Philemon and Baucis are killed. And for the first time in this book, and we're 11,000 lines of poetry into it, for the first time in this book, Faust feels responsibility. He feels moral guilt. He says, I should not have done that. I killed these harmless, innocuous old people on account of my pride. Here we have, for the first time, Faust becoming guilty, taking moral responsibility. We have here the upswing of the curve, away from the end of the first part, and he is, for the first time, assailed by certain evil spirits, care and want, and what are the other ones? Two more. The key one is care that stays with him. He's able to dispense with the others, but care and worry is still there. And care breathes on him and blinds him. Again, think of Greek tragedy where somebody like Tiresias, the blind seer, now that he finally has moral vision, now we make him blind. The contrast is both ironic and touching. Blindly, we are now in the final part of the second act, or the second part. There's digging going on outside. Devils, under the influence of Mephistopheles, are digging Faust's grave. Faust believed that these are his workmen reclaiming more land from the sea. And finally, he says, on hearing these men digging his grave, he says, "Stay, moment, stay, thou art so fair." He has finally seen something valuable in the world, extending the boundaries of human capacity, doing something not merely for himself, not merely in an amoral or arbitrary way, actually understanding that there is value in the world, and this value is by ceaseless human striving. Faust is a universal hero of culture. Any sort of striving can be represented as this. Any sort of achievement can be seen as valuable if you commit yourself to it fully. It's both classic and romantic. It brings together so many themes in Western literature. Now, while I'm on the topic of, and then, of course, Faust having said, stay moment, stay, he dies, and Mephistopheles is rubbing his hands together, he's got the devils ready to take him down and away, and all of a sudden, of course, we get not a deus ex machina, but a kind of deus in vita, right? In other words, we get a kind of God in life itself, and God comes down and says, look, I've been watching this all along, all right, I was in the prologue and I'm back. And I've sent down the angels to bring Faust up to heaven. Why? Because all his sins have been forgiven by the grace of God. Because what redeems Faust is not the fact that he is sinless. What redeems Faust is the fact that he has taken things to the limit. He is a representative of unlimited human striving. So he goes up to heaven. Mephistopheles has not understood the context in which Faust said, stay moment, stay, thou art so fair. He thinks that's a kind of resignation to damnation. In fact, it is his apotheosis. Right? It's a beautiful and very moving scene. And of course, one of the angels, one of the celestial figures that comes and helps Faust move into heaven, become saved, is Gretchen, who is now represented as the penitent woman. In other words, she has also been saved. God has all the best lines in this play. And they're short lines like, is saved, right, at the end of each of the acts. But up they go, right? And what has defeated Mephistopheles is the thing that Faust did not understand in the beginning, but does understand at the end. Faust has come to understand love. Faust has found value in the world, and Mephistopheles has not. And that is why he has been fooled. It's the only thing, apparently, that Mephistopheles doesn't understand. Before I finish, I ought to talk a little bit about the main themes in this. And when you go back and read it on your own, which you will have to do, some things you ought to think about. Number one, activity and passivity replace good and evil. The usual conventional understanding of morality is reversed or changed. Being turns out to be the same thing as doing. And heaven is not someplace else. It is the end of our striving. Being is reconciled with becoming when the quarry is the chase. Pascal, in one of his bitterest lines, once says that we want the chase, not the quarry. Well, Goethe, in a way, rejoins to that when the chase is the quarry, then and only then are we blessed. Then and only then can we be saved. The difficulty with religion is that it turns desire towards self-destructive guilt. Look what it did to poor Gretchen. The only cure for Christianity is the magic oblivion of art, which we get in the beginning of the second part. Science produces dwarfish monsters. Look at homunculus, a would-be human being. And that's the high point of intellectual life. Endless labor is needed to retain the cleared ground. The sea is nature, the land is culture. The unity of Germany and Greece, the unity of the classical and the romantic, represented by Helen and Gretchen. And salvation is possible only through inspired labor, not through guilt and remorse. Remorse is always, in some respects, defective. Now, let me just finish with this kind of an observation. Many people have wondered about that final line, die ewige Weiblich zieht uns hinan. The eternal feminine leads us upwards or leads us aloft. You might want to say that our connection with the spirit of creativity is what redeems us. You might want to say that every day is Judgment Day, and that our activity in this world is the only source and the only possible salvation. In other words, what we have here is not an alternative to religion, but an intensification of religion. We need not wait for heaven. In a way, it's connected to the idea that Tolstoy had, the kingdom of God is within you. Don't wait for it to happen, make it happen. You are your activities. You are not divorced from them. Passivity is evil. Resignation is evil. Goodness, even though it may be, goodness is connected with activity, even occasionally sinful activity. It is, if it is done intensely and from the best of motives. This is one of the greatest constructions of the human mind. No short lecture can do justice to this great work of art. You should read it. It is good for your soul. The difficulty is your soul needs a couple of months off, right, in order to absorb this. Right? It's the kind of thing that you make a commitment to and that you take seriously. It's like trying to read all the Platonic dialogues or all the works of Shakespeare. It's all good for your soul, but the contemplative life is not accessible to many people who are involved actively in the world. If there is anything that you can say about Faust himself, is that he is not just a representative of Western culture, not just a representative of the artistic or creative man. He is a representative of all human aspiration, all the self-overcoming that we see not just in poets, not just in religious figures, but also in artists and saints and philosophers. The sort of amoral, the sort of transcendental immanence, the sort of salvation in the face of immorality reminds me in many respects of Hegel's idea of the world historical individual who does great evil and is yet a part of God's providential plan. In other words, God has the last laugh. The world is bigger and more complex than we think, and our puny ideas of sin should not constrict or prevent our creative activity here in the world. If there is anything important about Faust, it seems that we ought to understand that activity is what redeems us, that being and doing are the same thing, and that we don't have to wait for some final deathly recompense for our lives. We are recompensed every day. Virtue is its own reward. Activity is its own compensation. Now, if we avoid regret, if we artistically fashion the world, we also artistically fashion ourselves. Faust, by conquering external nature, by engaging in activity, also managed to conquer internal nature. By cultivating and civilizing the external world, he cultivates and civilizes his own psyche. Faust, then, is the universal hero of culture. He is the greatest achievement of German Romanticism and one of the greatest achievements of Western culture. The heterogeneous qualities, the odd structure of this, are perhaps the only way to get across a book which wants to talk about every facet of human life, which wants to connect all possible human striving and endeavor in one unified conception. Again, think back to something like Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. In the fourth movement, he finally breaks through musical sound and has to start talking. We have to think differently about the symphony after Beethoven does this. Well, we must think differently about poetry after Goethe does this, and by implication, we must think differently about life now that we have been offered a new source of this worldly, secular salvation. Our transcendence is imminent. The good that we were searching for in the beginning of this poem is in fact always been before us.